daughter's
My name is
future.
Callie. I'm
Now
28 years
everyone
old.
knows.
And the night I threw my mother-in-law out of my house, I was standing in my kitchen at 11:40 p.m., holding my 2-week-old daughter in one arm and a small brass tin in the other. The tin was cold. It had been sitting in the bottom of my diaper bag for 6 days, tucked under the burp cloths, and I had no idea how it got there. "Vivian?" I said. "What is this?" She didn't answer. She just reached for it, the way you'd reach for something that belonged to you and had accidentally ended up in a stranger's hands. I pulled it back. That was the first time I saw my mother-in-law's face go completely still. Not angry, not embarrassed, calculating. 3 months earlier, Vivian had walked into my hospital room holding a bouquet of white peonies and told me, "Family takes care of family, Callie. You'll understand that soon enough." I thought it was a welcome. I didn't know it was a warning. By the time I found that tin, I understood exactly what kind of family I'd married into, and exactly how far Vivian was willing to go to make sure my daughter belonged to her more than she belonged to me. What was inside that tin didn't just end my relationship with my mother-in-law, it nearly ended something much bigger. And it started with 4 words I never thought I'd say to the woman who raised my husband. "Get out of my house." Before all this, I was a postpartum nurse at Riverbend Medical Center, the kind of nurse who could read a person's real condition in 90 seconds, no matter what they were saying out loud. 11 years on the floor teaches you that. Vitals don't lie. People do. My husband Derek was easy, steady job doing HVAC repair, home by 6 most nights, the kind of man who fell asleep on the couch with a game show still playing. We'd been married 3 years when I got pregnant with Ruthie. Vivian, Derek's mother, had been alone since her husband Walter died 4 years earlier. Derek talked about her like she was fragile. "Be patient with my mom," he'd say. "She's had a hard time since Dad passed." So I was patient. When she showed up unannounced with a casserole dish that still had her late husband's name taped to the lid, "Walter," I said thank you. When she rearranged my spice cabinet alphabetically while I was in the shower, I laughed it off. There was a night I actually remember fondly, back in my 7th month. Vivian came over with a hand-knitted blanket, pale yellow, and sat on the edge of our bed while I rested. She smoothed the blanket over my stomach and said, "This baby is going to be so loved. So protected. You'll see. We take care of our own in this family." At the time, it felt like the kindest thing anyone had said to me in months. I actually cried. I charted my patients' conditions every day for a living: confusion, minimization, denial, the small verbal tells that something was being covered up. I never once thought to run that same checklist on my own mother-in-law. That blanket is still folded in Ruthie's nursery closet. I can't look at it the same way anymore. Ruthie was 11 days old the first time Vivian broke a rule I'd made clear from day one. No unapproved food, no unapproved liquid, nothing near my daughter's mouth without my say-so. Our pediatrician, Dr. Halpern, had been explicit. Ruthie was borderline low weight, exclusively breastfed, no water, no tea, nothing. I walked into the nursery at 2:15 in the afternoon and found Vivian tilting a 4-ounce bottle toward Ruthie's lips. The liquid inside was pale gold, not milk. "What is that?" I asked. "Chamomile," Vivian said, like I'd asked her the time. "Just a little. My mother gave it to Derek. It settles their stomach." She's 11 days old, Vivian. Her pediatrician said nothing but breast milk. Vivian capped the bottle slowly. "Doctors don't know everything, sweetheart. Some things you learn from raising 4 children, not from a textbook. I need you to never do that again." "I raised your husband," she said, voice suddenly sharp, "and he turned out fine. I think I know what I'm doing." That was the first time I heard the tone underneath her sweetness. Thin, controlled, and absolutely unwilling to be corrected. I told Derek that night. He rubbed his eyes and said, "She's just old school, Cal. She didn't mean anything by it. She gave our daughter something against direct medical instructions. I'll talk to her," he said. He did not talk to her. Not really. Not in a way that changed anything. 3 days later, I found a second bottle in the diaper bag, already rinsed and dried, sitting where I hadn't put it. No note, no explanation. Just there, like a door that had been quietly left unlocked again. That's when I noticed the tin for the first time. Small, brass, dented at one corner, roughly the size of a deck of cards, sitting at the bottom of the bag underneath the spare onesies. I picked it up. It rattled faintly, like folded paper, and something metal shifting together. It was locked, a tiny keyhole no bigger than a pinhead. "What's this?" I asked Vivian the next time she visited, holding it up. She reached for it fast, faster than a woman who supposedly wasn't quick on her feet anymore, the excuse she used every time Derek asked her to slow down on the stairs. "That's family business, sweetheart. Not yours yet. You'll understand when the time's right. Not yours yet." Not nothing, not just an old trinket. A phrase that implied ownership was coming, on a timeline only she controlled. I didn't push. I put the tin in the top drawer of Ruthie's dresser instead of the diaper bag, and I told myself I'd ask Derek about it later. I didn't know yet that it would take me 2 more months, and a lot more damage, before I found out what was actually inside. Once I started paying attention, I couldn't stop seeing it. Vivian began showing up unannounced twice a week, always with a key I never remembered giving her. A spare Derek had cut for emergencies without telling me. She'd rearrange the nursery. She'd move Ruthie's crib 6 inches from the wall for better airflow. She'd tell visiting relatives, in front of me, I basically run this house when Derek's at work. At Ruthie's 1-month baby shower, 32 people in my sister-in-law's backyard, string lights, a sheet cake that said, "Welcome, baby Ruth." Vivian stood up with a glass of lemonade and made a toast. "To my granddaughter," she said, "who I already love more than anything in this world, and to Callie, who's still learning." 32 people laughed. I smiled because I had a paper plate in one hand and nowhere to put my face. My mother-in-law had just publicly called me incompetent at my own baby's party, and everyone treated it like a joke between family. That night, I asked Derek, "Did you hear what she said?" She was just teasing. "You're too sensitive lately, Cal. I think it's the hormones. I've charted enough postpartum patients to know exactly what that sentence does to a woman. It doesn't just dismiss you, it makes you doubt your own read on reality, which is precisely the point." 2 weeks later, Vivian took Ruthie to a family gathering across town without telling me. Derek had said yes without asking me first, because it's just my mom. "Cal, relax." I called 4 times before anyone answered. When I arrived, Ruthie was being passed between 6 relatives I'd never met, and Vivian said brightly, "Oh, we didn't want to bother you. You looked tired." That was the second time she overrode a decision that was mine to make. It would not be the last, and each time, the story afterward made it sound like I was the problem, too anxious, too controlling, too tired to trust. By the end of that week, I stopped assuming Vivian's behavior was thoughtlessness. I bought a plain composition notebook at the drugstore for $2.49 and started keeping a log, dates, times, what she said, what she did, word for word whenever I could remember it. Nurses chart for a reason. A pattern only becomes visible once you write it down, in black and white, where nobody can talk you out of what you saw. There was one more moment that week I still think about. Vivian showed up at 7 a.m., before I'd even had coffee, and found me crying quietly over the bathroom sink. Normal postpartum exhaustion, nothing more. For about 10 minutes, she was different. She made me toast, sat with me on the bathroom floor, and said, "I remember this part. It gets easier, I promise." I was terrified with Derek, too. It was the first completely unguarded thing I'd heard her say. Then Ruthie started crying down the hall, and Vivian was up and moving before I could even stand, calling out, "It's all right, Grandma's here," in a voice that made it sound like the room, and the baby, already belonged to her. What I didn't know yet was that the pattern went back further than my marriage, and further than my daughter. The turning point came on a Tuesday, 9:40 in the morning, when Derek left his laptop open on the kitchen counter with his email still logged in. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for the pediatrician's portal link, but a subject line caught my eye. Grandchildren's Trust, Walter Est. I clicked it before I could talk myself out of it. It was a forwarded chain between Vivian and a family attorney named Preston Okafor, dated 8 months before Ruthie was even born. The email described a clause in Walter's estate, a grandchildren's education trust, that gave whichever grandparent held primary caregiving involvement discretionary control over disbursements until each grandchild turned 25. Buried in the third email, Vivian had written, "I want to be listed as co-trustee before the baby arrives. Derek doesn't need to know the details, just that I'm helping. Callie especially doesn't need to know." My hands went cold reading that. This wasn't a grieving grandmother overstepping out of love. This was a plan, drafted months in advance, with a lawyer, specifically written to keep me and my own husband in the dark. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I decided to find out what was in that locked brass tin, whatever it took. I drove to a hardware store on my lunch break, bought a small tension wrench set meant for old jewelry boxes, and that night, after Derek and Ruthie were asleep, I picked the lock myself. Inside were 3 things: a spare house key I hadn't cut, a folded photocopy of Ruthie's birth certificate that Vivian had no legal reason to possess, and a business card for a family court mediator with a note on the back in Vivian's handwriting. Ask about grandparent standing, Marcus's case, 2019. Marcus, Derek's older brother. I'd only met him twice at holidays, always distant, always short with his mother. I'd never once asked why. I picked up my phone to call him. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice flat and guarded the second I said my name. "She's doing it again, isn't she?" he said. Not a question. Marcus told me everything over the next hour, and I sat on my closed toilet lid so Derek wouldn't hear me through the wall. 5 years ago, when Marcus and his ex-wife Priya were going through a rough patch, Vivian had quietly positioned herself as the stable presence for their son, Theo, offering money, offering to cover daycare, offering to just help while they worked things out. When Marcus and Priya separated, Vivian used the trust clause and a friendly relationship with Preston Okafor to petition for formal grandparent visitation rights, framing Marcus as unstable in a private letter to the court. She won partial custody weekends before Marcus even knew there'd been a hearing. She didn't do it for Theo, Marcus said. She did it so she'd never lose access to the trust and never lose control. My mom doesn't do anything without a reason, Callie. You should know that by now. Isn't it strange how a family can watch someone do this once and just let it happen and call it grief? Tell me in the comments if you've ever had a relative rewrite history to make themselves the victim. I confronted Derek that night with the printed emails on the kitchen table between us. She wants co-trustee status. She wants it before anyone finds out. She did the same thing to Marcus and Priya. Derek went pale reading it. I didn't know any of this. I believe you. But she does this because it works. Because everyone in this family calls it love and looks away. 2 days later, Vivian came over with an envelope. Inside was a document, a family harmony agreement, drafted by Preston Okafor, offering to formally step back from any custody or trust dispute, to apologize publicly for the shower comment, to give us, in her words, total peace. All I had to do was sign a clause granting her unsupervised weekly visitation and co-signature authority on Ruthie's education trust to keep the peace and honor Walter's memory. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Vivian said, sliding it across the table. "Respect. A real relationship with your mother-in-law. I'm offering you exactly that." It was, almost word for word, everything I'd wanted from her since the day I married Derek. Acceptance, belonging, peace. It also would have made her legally untouchable and made my daughter the second child she'd use the same playbook on. "I need you to leave," I said. "And take this with you." Vivian's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake, Callie. You're going to isolate this family over paperwork." "It's not paperwork," I said. It's a 5-year-old strategy with my daughter's name on it now. She stood, smoothed her blazer, and picked up the envelope. At the door, she turned back one more time. I hope you remember when this all falls apart, that I offered you peace first. I didn't answer. I just held the door open until she walked through it. Before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand something. I didn't confront Vivian that same night. I waited 9 days. I called Marcus. I called Priya. I called an estate attorney of my own, a woman named Renata Ford, and I brought her copies of everything. The emails, the trust clause, Marcus's custody documents, the mediator's card with Vivian's handwriting on the back. 9 days of silence while Vivian believed I was still deciding whether to sign. 2 weeks after the Harmony Agreement was offered, Derek's whole family gathered for Walter's birthday dinner. 16 people at his sister's house, the same kind of gathering where Vivian had once called me, still learning in front of 32 guests. Vivian stood to make another toast. Before she could finish it, I stood too. Before you go on, I said. I think everyone should hear something Vivian said back in April, in an email to Preston Okafor. She wrote that Derek and I didn't need to know the details of the trust, especially me. The room went silent. Vivian's smile didn't move, but her knuckles went white around her wine glass. I also think Marcus and Priya should tell everyone here what happened to their custody arrangement 5 years ago, and how it happened. Marcus stood up beside me. Priya, who I'd never even met in person until that week, stood up too. Vivian's face cracked, just for a second, just long enough for me to see something real underneath it. I only ever wanted to matter, she said quietly, almost to herself. After Walter died, I had nothing left that was mine. For one breath, I felt for her. Then she straightened her shoulders and said, loud enough for the table, everything I did out of love. You'll understand that when you're older, Callie. Family takes care of family, I said back to her, her own words, the ones she'd said to me holding those white peonies. You're right. That's exactly why I called Renata Ford 3 days ago and reported the trust manipulation to Walter's estate executor. That's why Preston Okafor is being reviewed by the state bar for helping draft custody strategy documents behind two mothers' backs. That's why the education trust is being frozen pending a formal audit. You could hear a fork hit a plate somewhere down the table. You wouldn't, Vivian said. I would, I said, because I take care of my family. Get out of my house, Vivian. Touch my daughter's trust, her custody, or her bottle again without my permission, and you lose your son too. She left that night without another word. 16 witnesses. Her own son standing beside me instead of behind her for the first time in his life. Derek walked me to the car in silence. Halfway across the driveway, he finally spoke. I keep thinking about all the times I told you that you were overreacting. You believed her story because it was easier than believing mine, I said. Not cruel, just true, the way a discharge summary is true whether the patient wants to hear it or not. I know, he said. I'm sorry it took hearing it from Marcus and Priya, and not from you, for it to actually land. I didn't have a clean answer for that. Some charts don't close with a tidy resolution, some just move to the next shift, a little more honest than before. 6 weeks later, the estate audit confirmed everything. Vivian had quietly redirected $14,200 from the grandchildren's trust into a personal account since Walter's death, funds meant for Ruthie and Theo's education. Preston Okafor lost 2 other family law clients once the bar complaint became public record. Vivian was removed as any potential trustee, permanently. I still have that pale yellow blanket folded in Ruthie's closet. For a long time, I thought it meant Vivian loved my daughter. Now I understand it was never really about Ruthie at all. It was the first soft thread in a much longer plan to make sure she'd never lose her grip on this family again. My name is Callie, I'm 28 years old, and the night I found a locked tin in my diaper bag, I thought I was protecting my daughter from one bad decision. I didn't know I was about to uncover a pattern 5 years and 2 grandchildren deep. Family doesn't mean access without permission. It doesn't mean silence in exchange for peace. Real family earns trust. It doesn't take it while you're not looking. If someone in your family has ever tried to rewrite love into control, tell us how you found out, and don't forget to subscribe to the Revenge Ties for the next story.